Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Last November, an Australian website called The Conversation featured this article. Here are 5 of the main reasons people continue to deny climate change. The fossil fuel industry, political lobbyists, media moguls, and individuals have spent the past 30 years sowing doubt about the reality of climate change, where none exists. The latest estimate is that the world's 5 largest publicly owned oil and gas companies spend about $200 million a year on lobbying to control, delay, or block binding climate policy. Their hold on the public seems to be waning. 2 recent polls suggest over 75% of Americans think humans are causing climate change. School climate strikes, Extinction Rebellion protests, national governments declaring a climate emergency, improved media coverage of climate change, and an increasing number of extreme weather events have all contributed to this shift. There seems to be a renewed optimism that we can deal with the crisis. But this means lobbying has changed, now employing more subtle and more vicious approaches, which has been termed as climate sadism. It's used to mock young people going on climate protests and to ridicule Greta Thunberg, a 16-year-old young woman with Asperger's who is simply telling the scientific truth. The amount of misinformation in this article is rather stunning. The entire basis of the article is a straw man argument. Everybody agrees that the climate changes. I've spent over a decade documenting historical extreme weather and changes to the climate. There's no indication that there is an increasing number of extreme weather events. Quite the contrary, death rates from extreme weather events have plummeted over the last century. The disagreement of skeptics is not whether or not the climate changes, it's whether or not climate alarmism is justified. 1,000 years ago, Viking farmers thrived in Greenland, and England's wine industry was competitive with France. But a few hundred years later, the entire Viking population of Greenland froze to death, and England was locked in a little ice age with the Thames River through London regularly freezing over. And 6,000 years ago, the Arctic was ice-free. The climate changes all the time, and it has nothing to do with carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. Nobody denies climate change. The argument is the exact opposite of what the conversation is claiming. This website calls themselves The Conversation, but they are no conversation at all. They've banned climate skeptics because alarmists were losing the debate badly. Even The Australian has criticized them for this cowardly, undemocratic move. The Conversation claims that skeptics are being paid by oil and gas companies. I've been doing this for 12 years and have never received funding from any organization. Most of the last 12 years I supported myself with engineering work, and over the last few months I've been funded by small donors on my blog. The reality is that there's very little money for climate skeptics, but massive amounts of money for climate alarmists. From 1993 to 2014, government reports show that annual spending on climate science grew from $1.31 billion to $2.66 billion, for a total of $42.49 billion. Of this total, $0.64 billion came from the stimulus bill. Annual expenditures in this category over the period increased over 200%. During the same period, other climate-related expenditures, including tax credits, grew from $1.05 billion to $8.94 billion, for a total of $104.29 billion, with $29.5 billion coming from AARA. The increase in annual expenditures in this category was 850%. If we combine both categories, total expenditures for the period grew from $2.35 billion to $11.59 billion, for a total of $146.78 billion. The reality is that the amount of money being spent on climate alarmism is about 1,000 times larger than what they claimed was being spent on skeptics. The Conversation makes the assertion that money corrupts and then ignores the fact that essentially all of the money is on the alarmist side. There's no question that money corrupts. It's exactly what drives climate alarmism. The Conversation brags about the fact that the massive propaganda push and censorship campaign has been somewhat successful. That hardly seems like something to be proud of. It's something which people in a democratic society should be extremely ashamed of. Then they claim there also seems to be a renewed optimism that we can deal with the crisis. But the reality is that climate alarmists, like the people at The Conversation, are sending children into clinical depression and drug dependency. Climate alarmists are telling children that they're going to die in 11 years unless they can convince the entire world's population to give up their heat, light, transportation, communications, power, meat, and just about everything else good in their lives. Given this insanity, it's no surprise that Newsweek reports a rising number of kids and young adults are being treated with psychiatric drugs in order to reduce the emotional stress and exhaustion caused by eco-anxiety, or a fervent fear that humans will go extinct as a result of their own pollution. This story was reported in the Boulder Daily Camera a few days ago. Naropa launches Climate Grief Group. Naropa Community Counseling will offer a paid grief group for those grappling with the challenges of today's climate crisis. Climate alarmism is not causing renewed optimism as the conversation claims, but rather it's causing despair and mental illness. Then they claim there's some sort of organized campaign of climate sadism against this poor little 16-year-old girl named Greta Thunberg who's simply telling the scientific truth. But reality is the exact opposite. Climate alarmists are using this 16-year-old child as a prop in their massive propaganda campaign. Blogger Michael Smith exploited a Facebook bug to uncover the fact that the United Nations was actually writing some of Greta Thunberg's posts. This employee of UN climate change was stealing Greta Thunberg's identity and writing some of her Facebook posts. And Greta's posts, which weren't being written by the United Nations, were being written by her father. The Facebook bug only persisted for a few hours, so we have no idea what other groups were cynically exploiting this child. Greta's father uses his daughter to demand that the rest of the world give up many things which they depend on for their day-to-day survival. And then he describes the criticism of what is essentially him exploiting his daughter as being hatred. This picture shows Greta Thunberg riding on a fossil-fueled powered train. She's eating food wrapped in plastics made from fossil fuels. She's eating tropical fruits which were brought to her on a massive diesel-powered boat. She has lived her entire life immersed in the comforts of a fossil fuel-powered lifestyle. She is a child who has no understanding of how she's being used by the adults around her. And those adults should be ashamed of their behavior. Torturing children like this with climate lies is incredibly cruel. It's a form of child abuse. Every single claim made by the conversation is the exact opposite of reality and projection of their own bad behavior. These people need to be stopped in this critical election year of 2020. I'm doing my part by making these videos. You can help out by subscribing to my YouTube channel and passing these videos around to as many people as possible. And of course, visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.